George Miller watched as his dog, Crosby, stared endlessly at one of the walls of their home. The dog did this day in and day out. Finally, George decided to install a camera to try and find out what Crosby was so interested in. After looking at the tape footage, George walked to the wall, which delighted Crosby. What the young man found provided the answer to all his questions. Before we start, can we get this video to 1,000 likes? Please hit the like button and subscribe to the channel. The 29-year-old was getting a bit lonely in his new city. So, to make himself feel a bit more at home while he was away from his family, George Miller decided to adopt a dog. Crosby was loving, loyal, and just what George needed in his new city. He and Crosby hit it off right away. However, there was something about Georgie's fuzzy friend that he was eventually going to find out. And, trust us, it's something really unexpected. It took George Miller a while to figure out what his dog was doing. He'd never seen Crosby do something like this after all, and George had adopted him a few years back. It doesn't take much for Crosby to befriend other animals. The next-door neighbor's dog and cat were pretty much Crosby's best friends, always playing and getting into antics with one another. Unfortunately, Crosby's two best fur friends passed away one after the other. While their owner was obviously heartbroken, they weren't the only one. Crosby was devastated over the loss of his two friends. What was George going to do now? George Miller and Crosby had been together for a few years and stuck to a daily routine of walks, feeding, more walks, and of course, playtime. That is until he came home one day expecting Crosby to meet him with kisses at the door. Something had caught Crosby's attention, and he was so enthralled by whatever it was that he didn't even answer when George called his name. After calling Crosby's name a few times, George Miller decided to get down to his dog's level and see what was interesting him so much. As it turned out, it was the living room wall. How odd. Crosby was staring so intently at the wall, it was as if nothing else existed around him, including his owner. Kneeling down to Crosby's level, George Miller didn't see anything wrong with the living room wall. So, why was Crosby so interested in it? And what caught the dog's attention in the first place? George was just happy to see there wasn't actually anything wrong with his dog. At first, he thought Crosby was losing his hearing. Now, he realized Crosby was transfixed on the living room wall. Was it a bug that George couldn't see? After a while, however, Crosby seemed to return to normal. He left the wall behind, ate some dinner, and snuggled with his owner like the wall had been forgotten. In the middle of the night, George Miller woke up needing a glass of water. On his way to the kitchen, though, the last thing he expected to see was Crosby once again staring at the living room wall. It was pitch dark. What in the world was the dog looking at, and why couldn't George see it? The next day, George Miller decided he would figure out why his dog was staring at the living room wall. Before work, he decided to go out and buy a night vision camera, setting it up in his living room in hopes of spotting what Crosby was looking at. To George Miller's surprise, the footage didn't show Crosby looking at the living room wall. It turned out that he really only did that when George was around, adding yet another mystery to this whole experience. Crosby might not speak English, but he was definitely trying to signal something to George Miller. Barking, scratching, and jumping around might be to go-to forms of communication for most dogs, but Crosby was sticking to staring. George Miller was stumped. He had no clue why Crosby was staring at the living room wall. Still, he went into the room and took another look, thinking he was missing something. Something unexpected happened when he walked into the room, though. Crosby started playfully barking, following George into the living room. It was the most energetic and happy George had seen his pooch since the neighbor's cat and dog had passed away. Egged on by his barking dog, George Miller got down on his hands and knees to further inspect the wall. That's when Crosby started barking more. It was like an odd game of hot or cold. Only one of the players couldn't exactly speak English, and the other had no clue if a bark meant hot or cold. George soon found out why Crosby was so intent on staring at the wall, though. After further inspection of the wall, George Miller heard an odd sound. It didn't take long for him to realize the sound was coming from inside the wall. This must have been the reason why Crosby had been staring at it for so many days. Now the question was, what on earth could possibly be stuck in the wall? And how was he supposed to get it? Whatever it was out? His heart was pounding with the realization. After finding the hole in the wall, George decided he had to find out as much as he could. So obviously, that meant sticking his hand into the hole and maneuvering it all the way up to his elbow. Moving his hand around the inside of the wall, Georgie's eyes widened in disbelief. George stretched his arm further down the hole. Finally, George Miller was able to get the creature out of the wall. To his utmost surprise, it turned out to be a tiny kitten. How in the world did it end up in the paneling between his living room and washroom? Even weirder, the kitten looked strangely like Crosby's late feline friend from next door. Did his dog have something to do with this kitten's lodging in the wall? George Miller couldn't believe a tiny kitten was living in his wall all this time. Crosby might have been excited about the house guest, but George Miller had no clue how to take care of a kitten. He hoped its owner lived nearby. So George went ahead and started asking around his neighborhood if anyone was looking for a lost kitten. While no one claimed the tiny creature as their own, the neighbors were saying the kitten looked familiar. She must be a stray, meaning a veterinarian visit was in order. George Miller brought the kitten to the veterinarian for a checkup. Thankfully, aside from being hungry and dirty, nothing was wrong with the creature. Unfortunately, she didn't have a chip either, so there was no way for George to find its owner. With no one coming forward to claim the kitten, George Miller was going to have to make a tough decision. Crosby was obviously thrilled with the tiny creature, turning back into his joyful and happy self after his two fur friends' deaths. But George didn't want a kitten. He talked to the veterinarian about other options, such as a shelter. It crushed him, but he wanted to make sure the kitten was in good hands. The vet was real with George, though, telling him the kitten was likely to be put down if he brought it to a shelter. During an interview, George said, "The vet basically told me that if I took her to the shelter, she'd be put down because there are already over 300 kittens at the county shelter alone that need homes. He said I could try putting her outside and hope she goes home, or I could keep her." After hearing that bit of information, it didn't take long for George to decide to keep the kitten. Crosby already seemed to take a liking to the tiny creature anyway, so he took the kitten home. Right away, George could see Crosby was overjoyed. He was going to have an animal companion in the house. Not to mention the kitten now had a loving home and brother to play with. It was a win-win. George decided to name the kitten Lil Ray Ray and made a vow to pay a bit more attention to Crosby when he does something out of the ordinary. Like, say, staring at a wall for longer than necessary. And even though he didn't really want a kitten, George knew he made the right choice. Crosby and Lil Ray Ray were like each other's long-lost soulmates, becoming instant friends, partners in crime, and of course, napping buddies.